Alright guys, we're going to cover the third question of the syllabus in section D, which is topography. The third question is known as the internal surface of the cranial base. If you guys remember when we were talking about the calvaria, we said the skull was divided into two parts. The skull cap, which is the calvaria, and the cranial base. Now we're looking at the cranial base from a superior view. We're looking down, okay, after we've removed the skull cap. And the cranial base consists of three fossae. It consists of a anterior cranial fossa, a middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa, okay? Now, as you can see in these three fossae, there are indentations, and that is for the brain, okay? So, okay, let's go ahead and start with the anterior cranial fossa. In the anterior cranial fossa, you have your borders. You have your anterior border, which is the frontal bone, and you have the posterior border, which is the lesser wing of the sphenoid. In this anterior cranial fossa, you have the orbital part of the frontal bone, okay, and this will hold the frontal lobes, okay, as you can see the indentations. In between the orbital parts of the frontal bone, you have your ethmoid bone, and the ethmoid bone is going to have little perforations. You see these little holes, and therefore the olfactory nerves passing through, okay, and they're going to pass through the olfactory bulbs, which will each be housed on each side of the cribriform plate. You're going to have your anterior ethmoidal foramina, which is this thing right here, and you're going to have your posterior ethmoidal foramina, which is this thing right here, okay? And they will allow for the anterior ethmoidal vessels and the posterior ethmoidal vessels and their corresponding nerves to pass through. And then right in the middle between the cribriform plates, you're going to have this crista galli. And the crista galli is going to serve as the attachment for the falx cerebri, which is part of the dura mater. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the middle cranial fossa. Okay. The middle cranial fossa is not that bad at all. You have, once again, the borders. The anterior border is going to be the lesser wing of the sphenoid, and you're going to have your posterior border, which is going to be the crest of the pyramids of the temporal bone. Okay. You're going to talk about the hypophyseal fossa. Okay. The hypophyseal fossa is important because it holds the hypophysis. Now, you can't see it, but on top of this, you're going to have a roof, which will be known as the cello-diaphragm. Okay. The cello-diaphragm is part of the dura mater, which is going to allow the hypophyseal stalk to pass through and actually let the hypophysis sit in the hypophyseal fossa. Okay. Now, I'm going to need a pen for this. Now we're going to talk about the cavernous sinus and the supraorbital fissure. Okay. We're going to use a different picture. Guys, by the way, this is page 13 in Netler's Atlas. We're going to go to page 103 now to get a better look at the cavernous sinus. Okay. So, right here, okay, as you can see, that's cavernous sinus. This is cavernous sinus. Passing through cavernous sinus, you're going to have cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6, and also the mandibular part and the maxillary part of the trigeminal nerve, okay? Along with the internal carotid, okay? And all these things are going to pass through the cavernous sinus, okay? Now, let's go back to page 13. Okay, now you see this right here, this area right here. This is known as the supraorbital fissure. And you're also going to have cranial nerves 3, 4, and 6 passing through, except this time we're going to have the ophthalmic nerve of trigeminal passing through. Okay, it makes sense because the ophthalmic nerve has the nasociliary, it has the frontal, and it has the lacrimal part, and that's going to go to this region right here. It's going to pass through here and go here. Therefore, it makes sense for the ophthalmic to pass to the supraorbital fissure compared to the cavernous sinus. Okay. Then we're going to talk about each foramina. I have this acronym called ORLOS because I just sometimes I can't because I think each cranium is different and just an easy way to remember the foramina. So I have this thing called ORLOS. Okay. So O, you have the optic canal. Now keep in mind the optic canal is technically considered part of the anterior cranial fossa because the medial part of the lesser renal sphenoid. The optic canal is passage for the ophthalmic nerve and the sorry, the ophthalmic artery and the optic nerve. And then you're going to have foramen rotundum, foramen rotundum, which will be passage for the maxillary nerve. You're going to have L, foramen lacerum, which will be passage for the greater petrosal. And you're going to have O, or los. You're going to have foramen ovale, which will be passage for the mandibular nerve. And you're going to have this small thing right here, which will be foramen spinosum, which will be passage for the middle meningeal artery, which is actually the large supply for the dura mater. Now, one more thing. You see this thing right here. This is called the carotid canal. This is the passage for the internal carotid artery. And it's important because the internal carotid artery doesn't give branches until it reaches the cranium. Okay? So the internal carotid is going to come here, it's going to loop around, and it's going to give off its branches. Okay? Now, that's it for the middle cranial fossa. Let's talk about the posterior cranial fossa. Now, the posterior cranial fossa is not that bad at all. Once again, let's talk about the borders. Anteriorly, the border starts from the clavus, and it extends posteriorly along the crest of the pyramids of the temporal bone, and it's going to extend posteriorly all the way to the occipital bone. Okay? Now, on the clavus, you should see the abducens nerve, in the posterior cranial fossa. Now, I don't have an illustration of that, so you're just going to have to imagine it. This is the clavus right here. You're going to have your jugular foramen. Okay, internally it's called the jugular foramen, guys. Externally it's called the jugular fossa. Okay, so passing through the jugular foramen, you're going to have cranial nerves 9 through 11. And you're also going to have the sigmoid sinus draining into it. And remember, in the jugular fossa, which is external, that's going to be the beginning of the internal jugular nerve, internal jugular vein. Sorry. And this thing right here, this little thing right here, that's going to be the internal acoustic meatus, which will be passage for the facial and the vestibulocochlear nerves. Okay, and also the labyrinth artery, if you want to be that detailed. And you have the big thing right here, which is called foramen magnum. Magna means big. You're going to have vertebral arteries, 2, one from each side, passing through. Remember, the vertebral arteries are the first branch of the subclavian, which arise and go through the transverse foramen of the cervical vertebrae and arise, go through the foramen magnum, and unite around this area right here to form the basilar artery. Okay? And you just have left the cruciform eminence, or other known as confluence of sinuses. Okay, these are just grooves for the sinuses. You have the groove for the transverse sinus, you have groove for the occipital sinus, and that's pretty much it for the cranial base internally. Okay, alright guys.